As we approach the end of MHA's story, as we've now entered the epilogue, it still feels as though there's a couple of things in the story that still need to be cleaned up. And that's usually exactly what an epilogue is for. See, an epilogue is to show us which characters got married, what happened to their abilities, did they recover from the final fight, what the rest of high school looked like for the class of 1A, now 2A, and so on and so forth. And thus, while there is a bunch of big question marks revolving around the MHA universe currently, there is a fair shot that the majority of them get their answers. But by far and away, the biggest question mark that is revolving around the MHA universe currently is Deku now quirkless? See, because over the course of the last 2 chapters, it seems to have been implied that Deku now only holds on to the Ember of One for All, much akin to how All Might only held on to an Ember of One for All after passing it on to Deku. And thus one of the most pivotal moments of chapter 424 was Bakugo wandering into Deku's hospital room, only for Bakugo to hear Deku telling All Might about how he's passed on One for All and now only holds on to an Ember of it. This led Bakugo to come to the realization that he and Deku wouldn't be stuck in a perpetual cycle of trying to see who's the better hero, because Deku is now once again quirkless, something that Deku actually agrees with and concurs on. So it feels as though the question has been answered, right? Deku doesn't have a quirk, and thus there's really no point in wondering as to whether or not he's going to continue being the wielder of One for All, right? Well, I don't know about that. See, here's the thing. Well, technically, the story of Deku beginning with him quirkless and ending with him quirkless would be a fantastic full character arc. At the same time, the world still needs a symbol of peace, and that's a message that's been hammered home in both chapter 425 and 424. And while yes, you could absolutely make the argument that Mirio could be that symbol of peace, one would assume, or at least hope, that that symbol of peace would be either Bakugo or Deku, both of which, who, as the story currently stands, may be permanently retired from the whole heroing thing, as Deku now only holds on to the Embers of All for One, and Bakugo's skeleton is more screw than bone. And here's the thing, while Deku ending the story as a quirkless boy does make a fair amount of sense for his possible character arc, Bakugo ending the story not as a hero doesn't. And therefore, Bakugo is going to continue being a hero, at least as I believe he's going to be. Then Bakugo would only want to be a hero if it meant that he could continue to compete with Deku. And thus I believe while the idea of Deku being quirkless is cute and fun, the story isn't going to end that way. And in actuality, I believe Deku will be re-receiving One for All rather soon, and I believe there's already been evidence given to us in chapter 424 to prove this exact point. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, today we're talking about Deku returning to the top of the hero world, because today we're talking Shigaraki gives All for One back to Deku. But before we get to talking about all that, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you love the idea of me breaking down MHA, then you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Now listen, people scrambling to find a way for Deku to get his quirk back is on par with the level of copium we've seen from people trying to explain we'll just say Gojo's whereabouts. Because by and large, while most people acknowledge that it would be kind of cute if Deku ended the story as quirkless as he began it, most fans of MHA want to see Deku continuing to be a hero. And I'd like to think that Horikoshi not only knows this, but is also building the story in that direction. Because if we're being entirely honest, the entire creation of this epilogue in the first place is to appease the fans of MHA who have stuck around through what Horikoshi has talked about as his least popular arc. And while I personally have loved the direction that MHA has gone in for the last couple of years, a lot of people have yelled at Horikoshi to get back to the school it, and thus the reason that MHA is returning to its title is because Horikoshi is trying to appease his fans. But Nick, how is Horikoshi planning to appease said fans? Well, the return of Deku's quirk. But how is he going to do that? Well, I've seen a couple of very interesting theories that answer that question exactly. 3 to be exact. So let's go through these 3 theories from my least favorite to my most favorite. And while I don't hate this first theory, I just don't find it all that likely. But still, let's talk about it. See, there's talk going around the internet that one of the ways that Deku will get his quirk back is that he kind of won't. That is to say that the form of One for All that Deku gets back will not be the form of One for All that he had previously. And in fact, that's actually a somewhat consistent line throughout all of these theories. See, the majority of people who are buying into the ideology that Deku will get his quirk back are also buying into the the idea that he won't get his meta abilities back, but instead his quirk will more closely resemble the version of One For All that All Might had, as opposed to the version that he had. And this first theory moves forward with this understanding of Deku's quirk's return. See, pretty much all of these theories revolve around how much Deku has been talking about how he still holds on to an ember of One For All, and how narratively that's kind of a weird choice. See, if we wanted to truly end the story with Deku being quirkless, then he would simply just be quirkless right now. However, how frequently Deku has talked about how he still holds on to the embers of One For All makes people believe that his quirk is gonna return in some reduced capacity. And the first way that that's theorized to happen is that Deku's quirk is gonna come back as a somewhat variation of Fat Gum's quirk. That is to say that this theory tells us that Deku's quirk is going to return as an expendable source. But let's extrapolate on that. See, technically, if you look at the time that All Might was holding on to the embers of One For All, it could very much be argued that One For All was an expendable source for All Might. The more he used One For All after passing it on to Deku, the less of One For All he had. However, this doesn't mean that All Might wasn't still able to accomplish an insane amount with this small amount of One For All. See, because while technically as the holder of the Ember of One For All Might could only hold on to his stronger form for 3 hours max, and his punches were significantly weaker, as he fully admitted that the Nomu that he fought at UA, he could have defeated in 3 punches, and this time it took him 300 punches, or something like that. I don't remember the exact amount of punches, but it took him many more punches than it would have if he was at full strength. And in his final battle as a wielder of One For All against All For One, he was only able to transmute parts of his body into his strengthened form, while the rest of his body stayed in his skinny, weak form. And thus, this ember of One For All inside of All Might was absolutely an expendable source. However, that source wasn't renewable. See, once that fire burnt up inside of All Might, it was gone. Forever. And while All Might's consciousness was still tied to the vestige plane forever, All Might would never be able to use One For All ever again. Now, this theory stipulates that Deku is in a similar position, as Deku now holds on to the embers of One For All, and thus Deku may be able to use One For All until those embers are expended. Though since Deku shot all of the vestiges into Tenko, or I guess Shigaraki, Deku won't be able to use any of the meta abilities that he was able to use in the later half of MHA. But does this mean when Deku uses One For All enough, it's gonna be gone from him forever? Well, this theory says no. See, instead, this theory says that Deku, because there is no second inheritor of One For All on Earth, as Shigaraki/Tenko is dead and gone, that these embers will be renewable. See, because the reason that All Might was able to extinguish the embers of One For All was because One For All was actively and continuously being passed to Deku. But since there's no passing happening in Deku's situation, while Deku might be the current wielder of a weakened version of One For All that feels like the embers of One For All, this might just mean that Deku only has a fraction of One For All, similar to the fraction of One For All that All Might had at the end of his run as All Might. But when Deku extinguishes those embers, that is, uses up all of the energy of One For All he has inside of him, eventually that power will come back to him. And thus the way that this technique is similar to Fat Gum's is that in essence these embers operate as Fat Gum's fat, an expendable resource that makes Deku stronger that slowly but surely rekindles over time, which I think is technically a possibility. I know I said this was my least favorite out of all of the answers, but narratively, this future for Deku makes a fair amount of sense. See, because if Deku were to fully reacquire One For All, minus the meta abilities, which I'm pretty sure he can't get back, that would mean that Deku was on the way of acquiring All Might's level of strength one day. And Bakugo, who now basically has a fake heart and blown apart hands, will never be able to approach All Might's level of strength. On top of this, the take-home message of MHA, especially in the final battle against All For One, was that Deku is not All Might. He was never as strong as All Might, and therefore he needed help from his friends and his classmates. This is why we have the on your left moment in the final battle against All For One. In fact, All For One straight up says this in chapter 422, when All For One says, "Midoriya, it's your weakness. It was something All Might lacked, a weak, feeble strength that spurs within these vermin to stand back up so doggedly." That is to say that the weakness that exists inside of Midoriya but didn't exist inside of All Might inspires those around around him to pick up the slack. And thus the idea of Deku getting the entirety of One for All back and being as strong as All Might just doesn't really jive with the general idea behind MHA. And thus Deku getting this weakened version of One for All that would still allow for him to be a hero, but not be a hero as strong as All Might, would not only keep him on par with a new fake heart blown apart arms Bakugo, but would also allow for all the people around Deku to still remain relevant as heroes. But this isn't the only possibility for Deku, because there are multiple people in MHA still to this day that could help Deku become much more powerful than he currently is. People like Mai Hatsume or David Shield. Now, the majority of you probably remember Mai Hatsume, the girl with the zoom quirk that allows her to see 5 kilometers away, that made the floating UA flying coffin. She made Deku's boots and his gloves and basically everything else that stopped him from breaking his bones every time he used his quirk. There is a solid possibility, as it's already been proven, that quirkless people can be incredibly powerful on the battlefield. Looking directly at you, Iron Man All Might, that Mai would be able to make an Iron Man-esque suit for Deku that would allow him to emulate a part of his original strength. See, because while sure, technically All Might burned through the energy of his suit rather fast, the reason All Might was burning through the energy of his suit fast is because he was battling against a peak form All for One. And thus, if Deku was to receive a comparable suit, he could use that suit in conjunction with the embers of One for All and achieve a level of strength possibly quite close to what he used to be. And so long as he wasn't battling against a peak strength All for One, he wouldn't have to burn through his energy nearly as fast as All Might burned through his. In fact, if you want to get really sappy with it, you could argue that both All Might and Deku would finally be able to serve side by side as heroes if they both got decked out suits. And since the resounding idea behind giving All Might this suit in the first place was that his years of hero experience made his ability to use all of these powers much greater than anybody else who could have received this suit, you could very easily make the same argument for Deku. However, it doesn't even necessarily have to be Mai who makes this suit, because in MHA's first movie, Two Heroes, we were introduced to a character by the name of David Shield, a former sidekick of All Might, who made for All Might a hero item that would allow for the weakened All Might to return back to his original strength. Now, this hero item was known as the Quirk amplification device, and he was kind of correct. See, because the Quirk amplification device would have made weakened All Might stronger. However, Wolfram, the bad guy from the first movie, got his hands on the Quirk amplification device, and that Quirk amplification device made Wolfram strong enough to battle against both Deku and the weakened All Might simultaneously. And thus, if Deku's able to get his hands on a Quirk amplification device or something comparable, it's a possibility with the embers of One for All that Deku would be able to achieve a level of strength that he possibly never even achieved with the entirety of One for All. And thus, there is a fair amount of routes without messing with Deku's quirk at all that could lead to Deku returning to his full strength. And while the idea of Deku flying around as basically Iron Man seems a little silly, we already did it with All Might. The possibility exists. On top of this, Horikoshi seemed rather committed to the idea of canonizing all of the movies at the end of this manga, as every time something important or pivotal was happening in the battle between Deku and All for One or Shigaraki, we would pan to people all across the world watching this fight. And more often than not, the people that we were seeing from all across the world were characters from the MHA movies. Not to mention David Shield and his daughter Melissa Shields were canonized in the manga in chapter 158, so like years ago. As alongside the dropping of chapter 158 was also dropped the special one-shot Everybody is Somebody's Hero. And thus the idea of David Shield or Mai Hatsume making some kind of hero item for Deku that allows him to become some semblance of the symbol of peace, to me, isn't really all that crazy. On top of that, if Horikoshi does decide to go this route, then Deku can truly be quirkless, because All Might was quirkless and he seemed fine. He made All for One like 10 years younger. But what about the third theory, Nick? I mean, we haven't even talked about Shigaraki yet. Well, that's because I was saving the best for last, ladies and gentlemen. See, this third theory, while technically my favorite, also, I believe, flies in the face of what Horikoshi is trying to build for the end of the story the most. See, because I've already established the idea of Deku getting the full strength One for All quirk back kind of doesn't work for the narrative that was built through the end of this story. This story, moving forward, especially in the epilogue, is supposed to revolve around everyone working together as a hero society to suppress the last embers of evil that are still out there in the world. And thus, the symbol of peace is supposed to be society, not an individual. However, my favorite theory, though it is the most outlandish, is that when Deku finds himself inevitably in a moment of need in this epilogue, as I think we can all agree that the first chapter of this course, Epilogue has introduced a villain that Deku will probably find himself battling against at some point. And while Deku is battling against this villain and is probably not able to muster enough strength of One for All because he only has the embers of it, in his time of need, Deku will once again enter the Vestige world. However, this time, there won't be all the previous inheritors of One for All there. No, this time, there will just be Tenko Shigaraki. See, as we all know, the reason that Deku doesn't have One for All right now is because he gave it to Shigaraki. And while this handoff wasn't the same as how Deku got it, Deku did slowly but surely fire every single one of the inheritors of One for All into Shigaraki so that they could attack him from the inside and break down his psyche. And we know that the only reason that Shigaraki was able to keep a tether to his own psyche when All for One tried to swallow him up was because Nana Shimura, his grandmother, kept a hold of it. However, it is largely implied by the speech that Shigaraki gives Deku after they defeat All for One. On top of this, in 424, when All Might and Deku are talking about how All for One came to an end, All Might is saying, "And you did your duty to One for All." And when he's saying this, a panel of him and all the previous inheritors of One for All are shown. However, rather notably, Shigaraki isn't in this montage of inheritors of One for All. But chapter 424 does seem to focus on the idea that Deku passed One for All to Shigaraki a weird amount, with All Might even confirming with Deku, "You passed it on, right? I felt it happening." And while one can make the argument this is a standard conversation that the two of them would have in a hospital room after this final battle, it seems as though Horikoshi is trying to tell us that Deku passing One for All to Shigaraki was more important than just getting Shigaraki to battle against All for One. But why? Well, this theory stipulates that when Deku is genuinely in a massive moment of need, that from the Vestige world will appear Shigaraki. And Shigaraki, a descendant of the original Shigaraki brothers who created One for All and All for One in the first place, will become the new beginning of One for All. But how and why? Well, one, he technically does have One for All and All for One, which is probably why Horikoshi decided to kill him. But two, we need to think about it for a second about how Shigaraki became the user of the Decay Quirk. See, it was revealed to us that Shigaraki was given the Decay Quirk by All for One, who found somebody with the ability to decay things and recreate them. And therefore, All for One took this quirk and augmented it, taking away the recreation part. And thus it is a possibility now that Shigaraki is the inheritor of One for All for One, and his own Decay Quirk, that Shigaraki would be able to re-augment this quirk and give himself back the creation aspect. But Nick, how is he doing all of this? He's dead. Good point. But how are all the previous inheritors of One for All able to pass on their meta abilities to Deku? How are they all able to have battles in the Vestige world? How is Nana Shimura able to make sure that Shigaraki's psyche didn't slip away under the boot heel of All for One? Death isn't necessarily the end in the MHA universe, especially if you're an inheritor of One for All. And thus this theory states that in Deku's time of need, Shigaraki, or Tenko, will appear in the Vestige world and use the creation half of their quirk in order to stoke the embers inside of Deku's heart, giving Deku back the quirk that decayed when he fired it into Shigaraki, and thus giving Deku back the entirety of One for All, Sans meta abilities. And thus Deku and Shigaraki would once again start the cycle of One for All inheritors, with Shigaraki operating as the new generation of Shigarakis that serve as the base of this quirk, and Deku acting as its first technical wielder. And before you sit here and say, "Oh, but Shigaraki doesn't have the stockpiling quirk," yeah, he kind of does. Let's not forget who all of the meta abilities were fired into at the end of the story here. So if anybody could serve as the cornerstone of the rekindling of One for All, it would be Shigaraki. Thus, while the idea of Deku ending up quirkless at the end of the story is cute and technically well written, the idea of Deku and Shigaraki finally having some semblance of friendship and working together would not only be exactly what Deku would have wanted, but would also draw a direct parallel between Shigaraki and All Might, allowing for Deku to use One for All, and thus Shigaraki would finally be vindicated by the story. Though if this does happen, Deku would become an inheritor of the full strength of One for All, though it wouldn't look like the One for All he's had for the latter half of MHA, and thus it technically wouldn't be as strong, though he would be able to achieve a level of strength possibly comparable to that of All Might, assuming he ever gets his body body as big and strong as All Might's, which he may never do, and therefore he may never achieve the level of strength that All Might had. And therefore there is the possibility that Deku, with a version of One For All that doesn't include meta abilities, would still have the weakness that All For One identified that would allow all the people around him to join him in being a unified symbol of peace. And thus, even with this ending that I find incredibly compelling and fun, it still could possibly be in line with Horikoshi's idea of what the ending of MHA should look like, which is why it's my favorite out of all of the possible theories. Now, of course, there is also the very, very distinctive possibility that Deku just does end this story quirkless, and that the final villain introduced in the epilogue is simply going to be the person that Deku expends the Embers of One For All on, and thus the reason that Deku keeps talking about how he has the Embers of One For All still inside of him is just so he can expend said Embers like All Might did in his battle against All For One against whoever this bad guy is in the epilogue, and that there is no actual plan for Deku to not end the story quirkless without One For All. But I just find the idea of him ending the story quirkless, though kind of cool, just not all that compelling. But I'm curious to hear from you guys. Do you want to see Deku end this story quirkless, or do you want to see him get One For All back? And if you do want to see him get One For All back, how do you want to see it? Tell me in the comments below, and while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I don't know, man. I just don't want to see him become a civilian. I mean, I guess like I said, he can be quirkless with an Iron Man suit, but that just feels wrong.